Good morning from Winnipeg. Today, we are very proud to have Professor Jody Mans Hennessy from Edmonton joining us for the last presentation of our workshop. Before I invite Professor Jody, let me have the privilege to read her bio. Professor Jody Mans Hennessy is the program chair for the Disaster and Emergency Management Program at NAIT in Edmonton. She is also the current president of the Canadian Risk and Hazard Network, which is also known as CRHNet. Professor Jody is a passionate educator who is focused on disaster risk reduction and the practical ways in which resiliency can be built in communities. In her spare time, she is also an acclaimed mosaic and glass artist, preferring to use reclaimed materials to create beautiful works of art. In that connection, we might need one piece of your work, ma'am, if you can send us. She is the proud wife of an RCMP officer and mother to two boys, both of whom are also seeking a career in police service. So, with this short introduction, let me welcome Professor Jody Mans to the workshop. Ma'am, floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the kind introduction. It is absolutely my pleasure to be here today. My apologies that I'm not able to be there in person, but as indicated, I'm stuck at home here in Alberta. We're also under a cold warning in the midst of some major house renovations and a whole lot of snow. However, I am grateful to have been afforded the opportunity to participate in this event virtually. So I would like to thank the Mobilizing Insights in Defense and Security Minds team for inviting me today. You can see that the title of my presentation is Preparing the Next Generation of Professionals, Shifting from Response to Resilience. As already mentioned, my name is Jody. I'm the program chair for the Disaster and Emergency Management Program in the School of Health and Life Sciences at the Northern Alberta Institute of Technology, a leading polytechnic in Canada. I know that your outputs for this event are focused on network building through collaborative knowledge sharing and exploring ways to prepare the next generation to deal with the myriad of complex challenges that the future presents when it comes to nature-triggered extreme events. It is this latter output that I'm going to be focusing on mostly this morning. Let me start by sharing with you a little bit of Alberta's story when it comes to disaster events. This information was pulled from the Canadian Disaster Database, which I know many of you are probably quite familiar with. I was originally wanting to pull a summary for a 10-year period because that seems like a nice round number from 2012 to 2022, but the database only had the information I needed up to 2018. So this chart only includes the 18 nature-induced disaster events that impacted Alberta and some of the other prairie provinces within the 6-year time frame of 2012 to 2018. Of course, the numbers here don't represent fatalities. They don't represent loss of livelihood, human and ecosystem suffering, total evacuees, and any indirect costs. These are just the direct costs only. I'll give you a quick summary of the chart because I know it's pretty hard to see the details. But of the 18 listed events, one of those events was agricultural. That was an event involving bovine tuberculosis. It cost almost $17 million. Of the 18 events, 9 were related to severe storms with hail, wind, and tornadoes. This cost $743 million. Of those 18, 4 were categorized as overland or flash floods, costing nearly $4 billion. And finally, of the 18, the last 4 were related to wildfires and grass fires. The total direct costs exceeded $4 billion for those as well. This is a high-level snapshot of the natural hazard events in Alberta. I would like to take a few minutes to dive into some of the larger events that have really contributed to Alberta's reputation for having some of the most costly disasters in all of Canadian history. So let's start with floods. On the left-hand side, you will see a picture of my hometown, Calgary. I don't live there anymore, but I still have very, very strong ties to the city, and I was personally very involved in the response to this event. As I'm sure you're all aware, in 2013, heavy rainfall combined with an unseasonably early snowpack melt created the perfect conditions for a significant flooding event. The Bow River, which runs alongside the downtown, tripled its flow rate, and the Elbow River had inflow rates that were nearly 40 times higher than normal. This event started in the beautiful mountains in Canmore, but the most significant impacts were felt across the entire southern part of the province. We had 4 people lose their lives at this event. Over 100,000 people were evacuated, and communities are still recovering to this day, nearly a decade later. I'll briefly go through a timeline and summarize some of the impacts of the flood as well as some of the consequences for the community. So in Canmore, which is the picture that you see on the right, there was a significant amount of damage done from the influx of water that was rushing down from the mountains in Cougar Creek, but it was mostly the debris that caused the sheer amount of destruction that was seen in this community. They have since developed a Mountain Creek hazard mitigation plan to better identify their flood risks and monitor the water flows in their different waterways. Calgary became the poster child for community organized volunteerism as a result of this event, which saw most of the downtown core and surrounding neighborhoods completely underwater. Our Stampede grounds, the home of the infamous Calgary Stampede, was underwater for weeks, forcing the cancellation of this critical event for our local economy. Businesses were devastated, and many homeowners lost their homes. Response services were so overwhelmed and, in fact, impeded themselves by the deluge of water that average everyday citizens started to self-organize into what became one of the most significant examples of volunteerism ever seen following a disaster event. And much work has been done to figure out how to better prepare for it, how to better organize it, and replicate it across other communities. Drumheller, which is another community in the southern part of the province, had previously flooded in 2005 and had actually made significant investments into their mitigation programming, including the construction of berms and new bylaws that restricted development in the floodplain. And they even required some of the homes and structures to be raised. And as a result, when the floodwaters came through, they suffered actually relatively little damage, but it would have been significant if they had not done the work that they had done. High River, ironic name, I realize, but High River was one of the hardest hit areas. They are still recovering, and some communities were not even allowed to be returned to, where homeowners were bought out by the government, and the space is going to be allowed to go back to a natural green space. For now, though, those areas still look like eerie ghost towns. They have, however, invested in new berms and floodways, a floodgate, and several other new bylaws and policies to better protect businesses and citizens from future risk. Then there was the agricultural region of Little Bow. Much livestock was lost here, and many people were displaced, and many have still not returned. The groundwater in the area was contaminated by the debris and E. coli. Bridges were destroyed, which impacted farmers' ability to get access to their fields to harvest. And this area also includes the Siksika First Nations, where 183 of the 200 homes on the reserve were critically damaged. In some cases, people had only less than 10 minutes of warning to actually leave. Then there was the community of Medicine Hat. They had a little bit more warning. They were able to put in some last-minute mitigation efforts through sandbagging, which saved a number of businesses and historic homes closest to the river. They have since invested in other mitigation efforts like building new dikes and berms. There was the community of Millerville. It's a small community, but a lot of its local infrastructure was critically impacted. In addition, critical supply routes, the highways in the area were damaged or destroyed, and there was significant damage to the Trans-Canada pipeline that runs in that area. Red Deer, actually, it's pretty close to where I live right now, had a lot of warning, and as a result, the Dixon Dam was able to reduce the flow rate and regulate the water that they knew was coming their way. So due to the early warning and monitoring, Red Deer was saved from a lot of damage. And then finally, I just want to mention Turner Valley, another community. Here, there was certainly flooding, but the primary issue was actually a natural gas leak that was caused by the debris flow, which resulted in more people needing to be evacuated. So this is an example of the many cascading events that can occur as the result of a severe weather event. So let's talk next about fires. I'm sure most of you are familiar with this 2016 event. Nearly 2,400 buildings were lost, nearly 90,000 people were evacuated, and also the disaster database indicates that the direct costs for this event, for the Horse River wildfire in Fort McMurray, Alberta, was just over $4 billion, but the actual damage estimates are pegged at closer to $10 billion. The consequences from this event were far-reaching and very persistent. Some of those include the impacts on water systems, our natural systems, and the drinking water. The water there still contains significant amounts of ash, potassium, nitrogen, calcium, heavy metals, and lead. It also had a significant impact on the oil and gas industry, and all of Canada benefits from this industry either as direct consumers or through our exports. Forests and lands about the size of the entire province of Prince Edward Island were burned. And this event highlighted the significant cascading impacts of disaster on mental health and long-term physical health, particularly lung health and chronic disease. It's seen with the high incidence of PTSD among the first responders as well as citizens, including many, many children. There's also been a number of significant flooding events in the areas that were burned as the entire landscape changed, and the loss of vegetation has impacted the erosion rates and water retention ability, increasing the prevalence of overland flooding in the area. And then, of course, just 5 years before this, in 2011, we had this other wildfire event in Slave Lake that also caused about $1 billion in damage. So we can't talk about severe weather events in Alberta without also talking about winds, tornadoes, and of course, our favorite thing, hail. Before we get there, I have to share that in 2020, Alberta had the top 3 spots in Environment Canada's top 10 weather stories for the year. And this included a hailstorm in Calgary that caused $1.3 billion in damage to property and grain crops. And then there were severe weather storms in the southern part of the province, causing damage that exceeded $221 million. Then there was more flooding in the northern part of the province, as I just mentioned, that caused an additional $562 million in damage. The total for that year was just shy of $3.2 billion. In July 2021, there was another hailstorm creating at least $600 million in damage and several other severe storms. This, along with the Southern Alberta flood of 2013 and the Horse River wildfires in 2016, mean that to date, 4 of Canada's most significant weather-related disaster events in terms of costs have, in fact, been here in Alberta. And then just this past August, Alberta set the record for the largest recorded hailstone ever. It weighed in at 292.71 grams and was 12.3 centimeters in diameter. It was actually discovered just about 60 kilometers away from where I currently live. We also suffered damage in that same storm event, but this was limited to mostly destroyed gardens, vinyl siding. Most of the hailstones in this event were softball to grapefruit size. So we're not only seeing more of these things, but they are increasing in intensity as well. I'm going to just try and see if I can play this quick clip to give you a snapshot of what it's like to live through one of these storms that I just described. We'll see if it'll work here. All right. I think you can see that. So this was on August 2nd of 2022. These people had to take shelter at the side of the highway, and you can see the hailstones hitting their car, and in a moment, you're going to see the windows all get busted in with these hailstones coming and crashing through their vehicle. We know many, many people that got trapped in this particular event. And you could just imagine how terrifying this must have been. The damage was absolutely extraordinary. So we know that things are definitely getting worse, but how much worse exactly? We need to have better data to try and figure out what we can reasonably expect in the years to come so that we can better understand what the risks are and how those are going to intersect with our changing demographics to create even more disasters. So thanks to some incredible innovations through places like the University of Lethbridge here in Alberta, which developed the Alberta Climate Records to create visualizations of weather data across 6,834 locations in Alberta, we can now look at province-specific data to identify important trends to inform what our future indeed might look like. In summary, we know the following, and please note that these are just some of the key messages that are provided by albertaclimaterecords.com. We know that Alberta's climate is warming faster than the global average. We also can expect an ongoing increase of extreme weather events. We know winters are warming across the province by 4 to 7 degrees, which has significant impacts on moisture in the soil because snow stores water. Agricultural production, with the growing season being extended by 2 to 5 weeks, and fire risk, making our fire season start much earlier and last much longer in the year. We can anticipate an increase in freeze-thaw days, which has significant impacts on our already aging infrastructure. So we can expect more cracks in the concrete and more potholes in our roads as a minimum. And we will fluctuate between wet and dry conditions, meaning higher occurrences of floods and droughts. Furthermore, according to the Government of Canada's Regional Perspectives Report, this is what Alberta's ecosystems are predicted to look like by 2050. In summary, they indicate the following. Prairie ecosystems will change with the high rates of warming. This means that some of our mountain ecosystems may disappear entirely, and many parts of the boreal forest will become aspen parkland and grassland. Wildfires, droughts, and flooding will worsen. More efforts need to be made to mitigate the effects of both water excesses and shortages at all community levels. Agriculture will be impacted by the changes in water availability, but also by increased pests and invasive species. And of course, social inequalities will be further exacerbated by climate changes and hazards. And everyone has a role in adaptation and resilience planning. We need more risk awareness and proactive collaboration. So we know that the climate conditions are changing significantly in Alberta, like everywhere else. So reasonably, the field of practice of disaster and emergency management needs to similarly change. If we're going to be able to have knowledgeable leaders in place to help guide the work that needs to be done, to plan and prepare, to mitigate for, to respond to recover from, and to adapt to our changing climate, and the risks that natural hazards, from the natural hazards that will result from all of this. So now that I've kind of set the stage for how disasters are changing into the future, I want to go into my next portion of the presentation, which is to focus on how the professionals of tomorrow also need to adapt and change. So now that I have painted a picture of the very real risks faced here in Alberta and across the country, let me shift focus to talk about some of the things that are influencing what needs to happen next. So in support of the National Risk Profile for Canada and the changing risk landscape, the Government of Canada, Public Safety Canada engaged with some national partners to develop a core capabilities list, Canadian Core Capabilities List, known as the CCCL. I should add that many of the groups were from agencies that were mostly tied to response activities, and that much of the foundation for the capability list was again based on the work that was already done in the United States. They have identified 35 capabilities as part of this work. The capabilities list was developed to better align strategic activities and priorities across Canada using capability-based planning, which acknowledges the uncertainty of risk while also creating a common framework for coordinating and measuring and mobilizing resources. The capabilities are described, and I quote here, logical groupings of emergency management functions across the entire emergency management system and provide the building blocks for effective emergency management practices across all jurisdictions. These groupings include resources, tools, and assets, personnel, and organizational structures, including policies and procedures. So the government has a clear role in creating policies and processes that will guide future-focused disaster and emergency management activities. They provide governance structures, they provide funding, and support that will help enable the critical work that needs to be done. But it's not really the government that will be doing the work in practice. That work is done by disaster and emergency management professionals, academia, and the multidisciplinary network of key stakeholders, communities, and civil society. I'll talk about academia and civil society in a little bit. So we have this list, but who is responsible for executing the tasks described on the list? When we look at the many stakeholders involved in the work of disaster and emergency management, and indeed the professionals themselves, we see some problems that need to be addressed in order to actualize the goals created by our government. What is interesting here is that currently and previously there is and was no independent body of theory that guided our practice as professionals. There was no recognition as an entity as a true profession, nor is there a consistent framework to follow for certification and consistency in hiring or even teaching. There were inconsistent outcomes and programs, a lack of common terminologies and translation of knowledge to practice, as well as a shared understanding of the core values and ethics. There was a lack of clarity about whether competencies are event-driven or future-driven. We have no governing body, no consistent jurisdictional autonomy, but there is a clear and growing acceptance of a national need, in part indicated by the creation of this list. There is also multiplicity of uncoordinated initiatives with consistent repetition of the same disasters and management issues, competition among stakeholders, where everyone continues to shield their own programs, difficulty advocating for policy support and funding in a way that is responsive to where the greatest risks lie, and some policymakers and political leaders simply just do not understand the system of disaster and emergency management. Fundamentally, there is an inconsistency in the teaching and recognition of this practice and within the practice itself, which makes it very difficult to action things like this. And lessons learned become lessons lost if they're not formalized into a foundation for future learning. Without those things, Canada will not be able to innovate and foster a true culture of resilience and adaptation. So, in knowing that we need to increase the capacity and competencies of the people that will be tasked with leading the work associated with future disaster events, we need to have appropriate job profiles created where people are hired based on the merit of what they know and not who they know. And we need to have people who have been specifically educated in the entire system of disaster and emergency management, who understands the interconnectedness of risk and the importance of mitigation and resilience building and adaptation over just the historical focus on response. So let's just quickly review what has shaped the field of emergency management of today so that we can better understand how this is quite different from what I believe needs to happen for tomorrow. A quick history lesson to set the stage yet again. So as our societies and civilizations evolved and new risks were being realized, and with more human-made and natural hazards, there was recognition that our society needed people who could focus on planning and responding to those risks should they be realized. The threats were perceived to be very, very real, and resources were allocated to people to focus on those tasks exclusively, and thus the emergency manager was born. Typically, the people who filled these roles and positions were male, paramilitary, and often as a second career retirement gig. People who understood what would need to be done should the worst happen. People who typically had some knowledge of what it would be like to be in the midst of chaos and panic and could help to inform ways to lessen the worries and respond through the use of objectives. That was what these people in their careers were typically trained to do. Over time, it evolved somewhat, but emergency management continued to be done, often off of the side of the desk of some other, often already overburdened professional who was familiar with the management by objectives approach in an emergency event. It seemed like a logical and even reasonable fit at the time, but our society has continued to evolve. So in parallel, so have the risks. And what we need to worry and think about are not isolated, discrete events anymore. We're talking about risks that extend far beyond any geographic or political boundaries, with risk of significant cascading effects across our complex, interconnected, interwoven systems. Dealing with systems requires knowledge of the entire system and the development of appropriate skills to reduce risks so that we can better protect people, our property, the economy, the environment, and our critical infrastructure. Our scope is and should be very different from our first responder counterparts who are experts on dealing with the bad when the bad happens, while our work should focus on thinking about what can be done before and after to stop the bad, or at least lessen the likelihood and the impacts of the bad when and if it does happen. We need to be relationship builders that can bring together all of the different players who have a part to play in the game. But we need to be the game masters that are making the connections and providing the 20,000-foot view and strategy. We are connected, but distinctly different. And I would argue it's time that we became a profession in our own right and reshape a new identity to carry us forward. With that being said, work started about 6 to 7 years ago to create some type of competency profile to guide the development of future-focused education and training programs, to develop emerging professionals, and also as part of our advancement and recognition of a standalone professional discipline of practice. Disaster and emergency management cannot continue to be seen as a function done off the side of another professional's desk, but rather a profession unto itself. There have been many, many different iterations of this group, but we now have a collaborative project being led by CRHNet and IAM Canada. That's the Canadian Risk and Hazards Network and the International Association of Emergency Managers in Canada, to develop a competency profile for the disaster and emergency management professionals of tomorrow. We have looked at similar competency profiles from Australia, New Zealand, from FEMA, and from many, many different papers published on the topic. We're also looking at things like the National Risk Profile for Canada, the midterm report on Zendaya and the Global Disaster Risk Reduction Roundtable, of which Canada is a member, Canada's National Adaptation Strategy, the reports from the Auditor General on Emergency Management First Nation communities, the Emergency Management Strategy for Canada, and all of the other related standards and legislation and a number of other documents to guide our recommendations. We know that there's a certain amount of scientific literacy that disaster and emergency management professionals will need to have, as well as technical literacy. And much like the next generation core competencies developed through FEMA, we also know that future professionals need to be competent in their ability to innovate, communicate, build relationships, work collaboratively, and most importantly, empower and enable others to take action, as the challenges that we face need a cohesive, supportive, and aligned collaborative action amongst all agencies, actors, and communities. It is only through individual action that we can achieve the collective change that is needed to become more resilient. So we've been working for a few years on this, and we will be deploying a survey across our networks in early 2023 to gather some final partner and stakeholder perspectives before we roll out our final recommendations on the project. Fortunately, in support of our march towards professionalization, we're also seeing an increase in the number of credentialed programs for disaster and emergency management across Canada. Not only are these being accessed by people who are already working in the field of practice but simply want the credentials to support it, but we're also seeing brand new entry-level people fresh out of high school who see this as an exciting, potential, credible career stream for them. We also are seeing more people bring their knowledge and expertise from other fields coming into these programs, which means we can have increased access to some incredible talent and ideas that can most assuredly be of benefit. These are some of the post-secondary institutions in Canada. Forgive me if I've missed any. I know that there's a lot more out there and there's more that are being created all the time. But these are the ones that I'm most familiar with that offer some type of credential, whether it's a certificate, a diploma, a degree, or a doctorate in disaster and emergency management. But we still have no accrediting body. We have no competency profile to map our courses against. And we have no unique national occupational code for prospective employers. So it's really hard to know the knowledge and skills that need to be developed. So up to now, many of the programs really were based on program or institutional leaders' preferences or strengths rather than driven by industry need. This is the one thing that we know needs to change. We also know that there is no such thing as a purist disaster and emergency management job out there. So we kind of are looking at this discipline much like the field of medicine. In medicine, all doctors start as general practitioners and then they specialize into their different areas. Some will focus on specific diseases, which might be risks in our world, while others will focus on education, some will focus on research, some will do bedside care, chronic care, emergent care, interacting directly with those people that they've chosen to serve. However, they are all unified in that they start from the same place with the same set of skills and knowledge base. That is very much what we believe the field of practice needs to be for disaster and emergency management. And so a competency profile will help to identify those baseline competencies that all professionals must have in this field. And the post-secondary institutions can then offer the pathways to develop in particular areas. But at the end of the day, we all need to be working towards the same common objective, which for medicine is to alleviate the suffering of people. And in our field, it is to create resilience and to facilitate adaptation so that we can better safeguard people, property, infrastructure, the environment, and our economy. We are at a critical juncture in what will one day be our history as a profession. Do we try to address the challenges of tomorrow using the practices and doctrine of the past? Or are we able to pivot and be responsive to the needs, the system of emergency management as we now understand it to be or needs to be? Are we unified as an integrated, focused discipline, clear about the ethics, the knowledge, and the skill sets that bind us? Or will we continue to be disjointed with the work that we should be doing and being accountable for an adjunct to the job description for someone else? Do we have the collective courage to shift and become what our world needs us to be? These are the questions that I ask myself and my colleagues often. And while I generally hear consensus, I still see that we have not been able to successfully make this transition, but I am very hopeful that change is just on the horizon. To quote one of my esteemed colleagues from Manitoba, Jack Lindsay, who is also a member of our core competency working group, in an interview he did for HasNet in 2019, he said, and I quote, "Just as many other occupations have passed through the steps of professionalization, emergency and continuity management is transitioning with new pathways into the career. Newcomers see their role as leaders within their organizations, even if many organizations may still treat emergency and continuity management as a minor task. Veterans still need to realize that the future of our profession and the practitioners who undertake our new challenges may not all be the same as in the past. We need to keep open minds and design our profession for the future rather than institutionalizing the past." So today I'm talking about this field of practice in disaster and emergency management, not as a true profession yet, but as a profession wannabe and needs to be. We are still currently writing our origin story. So let's go to the next slide. So what I'm suggesting is that we need the professionals of tomorrow to look at risk through a completely different lens. We need to create landscapes of practice rather than single communities of networks that only come together during response and then return to their respective silos for the rest of the time. Risks need to be planned for, eliminated, or mitigated for and studied so that we can better anticipate where changes in action and actors are needed. There's a general acknowledgement now that if we only continue to focus on response, including response exercises, activities, and funding response work, then it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy that that is all we will ever do. We need people who are knowledgeable about risk and cascading risks and understand these systems of disaster and emergency management and how they're interconnected so that we can anticipate the potential failures and weaknesses in the systems in advance and then take collaborative action to mitigate the harm that may come from those failures. We also need to focus on creating more resilient structures, communities, and economies so that when things like nature-induced disasters occur, they don't devastate families and businesses. This means that we need people who can lead, to engage with a wide variety of specialists and stakeholders who can inspire action at the community level, who can identify and anticipate risks and develop forward-thinking strategies to manage them. People who understand how social or societal vulnerabilities and changing demographics amplify disaster risk. And people understand that nature will always have the upper hand. And as parts of the natural system, we need to learn how to better adapt to the hazards in our natural environment. Of course, this is because there is no such thing as a natural disaster. Disasters are always socially constructed events. We are both the cause and the solution. The new lens for the next generation of professionals is not just planning and exercising, incident command structures, and emergency social services. It is all that and much more. An understanding of how those are just parts of a much bigger and far more complex system. Our future professionals need to be confident leaders. They need to know how to access knowledge and expertise from the other disciplines to complement their own. They need to be strategic, forward-facing, and systems-focused, and it's a big shift from our paramilitary response command and control background. We need to honor that legacy, though, and our roots, but we also need to never, ever divert our eyes from what lies straight ahead. So we've talked about government and we've talked about academia. Now we need to talk briefly about civil society. We often talk about this all of society approach, or what I think was similarly referred to in this group as the all agencies approach. As I said before, disasters are socially constructed events, which means that we need to tap into our social capital, our people, and their talents, skills, abilities, and capacities in order to address the risks in the most effective and relevant way. I teach several courses that are focused on resilience building, mitigation, and disaster risk reduction. And one thing that I always say is that these are not things that can be done to a community or to an organization or to a country. It needs to be done alongside them, in support of them, but always driven from the bottom up with good leadership in place. It is a necessity that civil society takes a more active role in risk reduction and management. Why? Well, what we're talking about is large-scale systemic change, and that kind of change can only be accomplished through the collective sum of individuals choosing to do something different. That's Change Management 101. So one of the primary roles for future disaster and emergency management professionals is to facilitate the engagement of society in all facets of risk reduction. This requires that there's better awareness and understanding of current and future natural hazard risks that we all face, and then identify where there is the capacity to support the efforts to mobilize resources and skills to improve resilience. In addition, by including the people who will be primarily impacted by these risks once realized, we can do a better job including the same people who suffer disproportionately when disasters occur by ensuring that they have a voice and their perspectives are shared. We achieve better buy-in and we can develop better, more meaningful and effective programs and plans that are community specific and respectful of the nuances and needs of the people. Remember that adaptation, by definition, is a process of change not just for one organism, but for an entire species. There are many opportunities for more intentional civil society engagement across the whole system of disaster and emergency management. in prevention and mitigation, and preparedness, response, and recovery, with an emphasis on risk reduction, resiliency building at every stage. But people don't know what they don't know. And that is where our disaster and emergency management professionals come in. So the role involves a lot more outreach, a lot more trust building and collaboration than ever before. And that's a big change for our evolving field of practice. And that's why our emerging professionals are challenged to develop their skills in advocacy, outreach, communications, and civic engagement. We alone cannot manage the anticipated challenges that will come with our changing climate and our increasing number of disaster events. So we need to change and do better to be more inclusive and willing to work far beyond our previous political, geographical, and philosophical boundaries. So this morning, I shared a bit about the natural hazard risks that we face here in Alberta, but that's not a unique story, as all of Canada and really all of the world is facing similar challenges. I talked briefly about the government's role in disaster and emergency management, specifically to the development of the capabilities list to enable capability-based planning to better identify and mobilize resources, both human and other, to start making those necessary changes to mitigate the impacts of these increasing risks. I talked about the ways in which we are preparing the next generation of professionals, both through our work in the development of a core competency framework to help ensure that future professionals have a shared identity, official recognition, and a common understanding of the system in which we choose to work, and to guide the ongoing training and development of these people across the country. Academic institutions hold responsibility for ensuring that people have access to the knowledge that is necessary to do the work and provide opportunities for specialization and progression. There is also an evolving role for civil society, which requires confident and capable leaders at the helm. But no longer should we treat our communities like hapless victims or passive recipients of information that they do not need to take action on. They are partners and sources of great talent, abilities, and strengths that need to be nurtured and enabled through targeted outreach and education. How can they be empowered to take action? So knowing where we need to head, knowing where we're at and what each of us is doing now, my question to all of you in the room and online is, how will you contribute to the future of disaster and emergency management in Canada so that we can all be more effective in addressing the risks from our ever-increasing nature-triggered extreme events? How are you going to support our evolution? I think that's all the time that I have. I want to thank all of you for your time and attention, and I would like to open it up for any questions at this time.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Jody, for a wonderful, I think, well-rounded discussions and ending with the big questions: what we can do in terms of contributing to this discussion on nature-triggered emergency. So, ladies and gentlemen, the floor is open for the question and answer session. And my plan is to have maximum 2 questions for now and open up for the next part of our session. And I'm requesting Professor Jody to kindly stay with us if she can. That will be highly appreciated. Questions? Professor, so Mike, please. Turn the camera.
Thank you so much for your presentation. That was very interesting. And my question is, now the changing climate of the working climate, or the new young generations, they're interested in working as some kind of a profession, or I don't know, maybe it's anything specialized. But I see next generations, their understanding of work is changing, I think. So from that kind of aspect, what do you see this emergency management as a specialization? Where do you see where do you see it's kind of going? Is it we still see as some kind of specialized expert type of thing, or maybe I would think they're more kind of a redundant, not redundant, overlapping with other professions as well, emergency management. So, yeah, where do you see these kind of specialties? Um, and maybe I don't know, more like multi specialized kind of area or generalization. Anyway, somewhere like that, I would like to hear your views on it. Thank you.
Great. I appreciate that. Thank you so much. Yeah, I think there's a couple of different opportunities. Certainly, I'll speak mostly about what I know from my program and kind of what we're seeing. But also, I'll bring in some of the conversations that we're having as part of our core competency working group, is that we really see disaster and emergency management as its own unique profession all on its own. So, that has more of that systems understanding. And, we will certainly do our best. So certainly in my program, what we focus on is we know that we are educating and training entry-level general practitioners. And then we also know that some of them who are coming in from other disciplines or who would like to pursue different level credentials or focus areas, they'll move in and they'll sort of specialize in those particular areas. But there is room, there should be room for general practitioners, people who understand the whole system, who can do a lot of this work around community engagement, but then knowing where to tap into the other disciplines. What we're also starting to see, though, is we're getting requests in from, certainly in Alberta, my colleagues over in the government Alberta, particularly in wildfire and forestry, are saying, hey, you know what? We think it would be really highly beneficial for the people that are coming into our field of practice, they're coming into wildfire management, that they need to have a baseline understanding of disaster and emergency management as a system. And so, they're looking at how do we create educational opportunities to sort of have people come out that have almost dual diplomas, one in emergency management and one that'll be in wildfire management. But they're seeing a need that there needs to be a little bit more of this cross training and a little bit more shared understanding that putting out the fire is just one piece of a much bigger problem, a much bigger puzzle that we're trying to solve, and that they would benefit from understanding what the rest of the system is about, so that when they're not putting out fires, they could be doing different work related to mitigation, prevention, and all of those other things, and understand how those intersect with other disciplines as well. So we do see it as a standalone discipline with opportunities for specialization. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. So we have next question from Gilbert. Yeah, go ahead, Gilbert.
Good morning. Can you hear me okay?
Yes,
Yes.
we can.
Good morning. Thank you for your presentation. That was very, very informative, I guess. And my question is, first of all, my name is Gilbert Fredette. I'm a former vice chief of Norrie House Cree Nation, a band member and working for the community still. I want to talk a little bit more about Indigenous inclusion when we're talking about natural disasters across Canada, and not just specifically Manitoba. I did a presentation yesterday that was kind of more focused on the human factor of what Indigenous people are still facing today, like all Canadians. But our situation is unique, as you know. We have 63 First Nation communities in Manitoba and over 635 across Canada. And I would have to say the majority are very vulnerable to a lot of natural disasters. Flooding, forest fires come into play. And on the East Coast, West Coast, more natural disasters with hurricanes and overland flooding and so on and so forth. I would like to know if we have a group or an organization that's going to have that inclusion with representatives from each community, representing their First Nations and reporting back to the Grand Chiefs, or however the structure is set. I think it's time now for First Nation people to showcase what they can do, instead of always looking as the victim in a lot of these natural disasters. I talked a little bit about the human factor and what we can do, and I'd like to see a lot more of that. Like I hear a lot of stuff happening, and within this day and age of Canada, we need more representation from our Indigenous communities and leaders, and being part of the solution at the table. I think that, yeah, we need to have our voice heard, and we need to be part of the whole system that's moving forward instead of being kind of treated as, oh, don't worry, we'll take care of you. We don't want that anymore. We want to make sure that our vision for the
Yeah, I think Peter.
But that's probably my question right there is, how can we do that? Like I'm involved still in the. Okay, I'll leave it at that. Maybe you can just respond to some of that, and I'd like to get all the information later, and maybe we can have another discussion. And
Yeah, sorry, Gilbert, I think I might have missed the question, but I think I got the gist of what you were saying, and I hope you saw me nodding emphatically as you were speaking. One of the things that we know is, first of all, I couldn't agree with you more. We know that that's a significant gap. Not only do we know that just as practitioners ourselves, but like I said, even in our core competency work, we're using information from we certainly have an Indigenous representation in the core competency working group. I should mention that.
I'm hoping that you can still hear me. Maybe you could just respond to the if you, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh no, that's okay. Sorry, did you have a specific question?
Yeah, basically all my comments kind of lead up to the inclusion factor. How are we going to do that? Is there room for organizational structure in fitting in Indigenous people?
Yeah. So yes, I think it's something that we've done very poorly in the past, and it's one of the things that absolutely needs to change. I know in the work that we're doing with the core competency group is we're making sure that we have Indigenous representation on the group as a start. We're making sure that we're referring to, like I said, the Auditor General's report on First Emergency Management, First Nations, but even our midterm report on Sunday. All of those things indicate that this is still a huge gap, that we are not incorporating traditional knowledge in the way that we need to, and we're certainly not, we need to be working with the communities, not for the communities, and empowering and enabling all communities wherever they're at. And we need to make sure that we can tap into that incredible knowledge that exists amongst Indigenous peoples across Canada as well. So we have a lot to learn, and we have a lot of opportunity to do things better. I think it's fundamentally important. I'd love to have an offline conversation with you. This is an area I'm very passionate about. I know in my program, we just created a whole course for our students. It's now mandatory that we talk about emergency management in remote, rural, and culturally distinct communities, focusing on Indigenous communities across Canada to help create some awareness about where those gaps are. And there's some other things that we're doing as well. But I'd love to have more conversation with you. My contact information is there, and perhaps we could set up a meeting. We could chat a little further about that, Gilbert, for sure.
Yeah, I would like that. And thank you so much. And my last comment is basically, it's good to have all the online programming and everything else like that. But I think having a live body speaking to different regions and expressing concerns as what we just talked about is very important. But thank you so much. I appreciate that.
Yeah, you're welcome, Gilbert. I agree.
Thank you so much, Gilbert. Thank you, Jody. Any other questions from the floor? If not, then we'll move to the phase 2 of our today's session. And I see General Dennis Stepaner is with us this morning. Good morning, General. How are you doing?
Morning, Kaiser. Very good. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So, General, we'll just take a couple of minutes to set up the room. If you stay with us, and Professor Jody too, just allow us to rearrange. We'll take less than 5 minutes, I promise. Thank you very much. And in the meantime, coffee and tea are here, but we are sorry we can't provide virtually, General and Professor Jody. Please forgive us. Slowly. Slowly. Sir. ক্যামেরাটা হলো তো